Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see you again. My name's Dustin Cormier. This is How to Rock Astrology. Today is meant as we've been continuing a series on talking about excerpts from a Stephen Arroyo book. But for those watching this video, this is anybody can join in. You don't have to watch the rest of the series to get what's going on here. We are talking about some of the implications of Pluto being in the first house, coming from two different texts. Now, eventually, I'm going to speak from another text, which is Jeff Wolf Green in his Pluto, The Evolution of the Soul book, classic. Today, we're going to be reading first from Stephen Arroyo's Astrology Karma and Transformation. And then we're going to also have another reading from another Western astrologer, Astrology Cosmic Science by Isabel M. Hickey, to get two different sort of perspectives on this. But if you do get a lot out of this reading, I recommend you check out the initial part of this series, particularly the video on Pluto in the houses, to get a deeper grasp on how to make the most out of Pluto's transformative energies in any house. Now, to start with, we're going to talk about Pluto in the first house. That's a very significant placement for any rising sign, obviously, because it's in the sign of the rising sign. Pluto's energy is going to be correlated with the self-esteem. And it's the self, like our self is what we try to use to project self-esteem. The fact that Pluto is crushing the very thing that's trying to get a hold of it can make it for some really interesting internal struggles within oneself under perhaps the helpless power of something happening in your physical reality that you can't control. So, let's consider Pluto in the first house by Stephen Arroyo. Just keep in mind that these are guidelines and are meant primarily to elicit insights in your own mind related to someone whose chart is being examined with Pluto in this house, the first house. How positively or negatively the various potentials are being expressed is up to you and up to the individual chart to judge. No house placement is inherently good or bad, but will always be transformative, and its fruits can bring its activity can bring extremely positive fruits in the first house. But not without struggle, typically. No, consciousness never comes to growth without some kind of pain, as Carl Jung noted, or at least pain, or at least effort. Now, this is Stephen Arroyo's Pluto in the first house. In the first house, the house of identity, Pluto indicates that the person's sense of self must be totally changed. Whether that means in this short period of Pluto transiting the first house, not short period, the long period, but either if this is by transit, then it's appearing in the chart for the period that it's in the rising sign, or if it's in your natal chart and you were born with Pluto in the rising sign, then this is going to be a theme that affects you throughout your whole life. You've been living incarnations in a certain way up to a certain point, and now the whole concept of the whole idea of the self is coming to a confrontation of what is useful and not useful to the soul in this incarnation. Although these people often have a deep and penetrating understanding, their insecurity and reserve prevents them from expressing it freely. These people desperately need to listen to others' opinions of themselves in order to generate a new feeling about themselves. But their very defensiveness about their sense of identity often inhibits this openness. Cooperation at a deep personal level is so difficult for them that they often wind up lonely and, in some cases, even alienated from friends and family. If the Pluto energy is used creatively here, the person can exhibit powerful concentration, a dedication to higher spiritual or social ideals, a real grip on one's own capacity to transform and transmute their reactive instinct towards unseemly, unconscious complexes in the psyche, and a remarkable depth of insight into life's deeper meanings. That's what Pluto in the first house can typically bring out of someone who has Pluto in the first house. It's really deeply the idea of self-esteem, self-power. Through dedication to something outside themselves is how they get the feeling of deep, true selfhood that they seek, not by emulating someone else. It's like the Bhagavad Gita says, you're better off living your own dharma in a challenging way than emulating someone else's dharma in a superficial way. Because yours is the more challenging and yours is the more meaningful. How do you keep your identity? Well, what do you keep in your identity? And what are you willing to sublimate? What are you willing to let go of in order to find the ideal of what you want to be while still letting yourself be what you are? What about what you are is obstructing what you ought to be? That's a real good question with this placement. And you'll experiment, and you might end up in the process of trying to trim your fingernails, you might actually cut your finger off. If that metaphor makes sense to you, in the sense that when Pluto through the first house has traumatic experiences that says, okay, I have to cut off whatever I've been doing that's making me have that experience. Bang. It's like somebody laughs in class out loud and the teacher says, you have to be quiet and don't just laugh like that out of nowhere in class, and the child gets spooked and says, I'm never going to laugh again. And then that laughter was an important part of themselves that they could balance with being quiet when it's appropriate. But instead, they took it wholesale that they should never laugh again. And now, years later, they're trying to... this can come up in any planetary transit to the first house, or even, in trine to the Pluto, where the person will have to confront how damaging it's been to them that they've stopped laughing. And that's just one of many examples that can come through this first house interaction. It's the identity is the key tone. Now, that was my reading through Stephen Arroyo, Astrology, Karma, and Transformation. Now we're going to read from Isabel Hickey, another Western astrologer. This is much less psychological, therapeutic, clinical. It's kind of bearing down more to a symbolical Grecian a cultural sense of what Pluto and Minerva, Pluto being the negative, heavy karma, Minerva being the transmutation of that karma towards positive use. This is what Isabel Hickey brings to the conversation of Pluto. So, Pluto in the first house. Here is the necessity for understanding the instinctive side of the nature. First house relating to instinct, Aries, the ram. When Pluto is in Virgo or Cancer in the first house, there will be a deep-seated inferiority complex. The individual does not have control or mastery over their instinctive forces. Somewhat like the person with Neptune in the first house, they are never sure of their own identity. There's nowhere to stand with regard to crafting a sense of self. No sure place to stand. They're usually gentle and very sensitive on the surface. If they panic or get upset, they can erupt like a volcano. And everyone is surprised at the amount of anger that suddenly comes to the surface. If Pluto is in Leo and afflicted, especially to the sun. The individual hides his insecurity by appearing bombastic and arrogant. This is a cover-up for his lack of confidence in himself. This just goes to show how, even though people considered Pluto to be generationally irrelevant, the sign that Pluto's in does color the tone, the energy field through which it expresses itself. If Pluto is in Leo, this means that you're a Leo rising because it's in your first house. So what does being a Leo rising mean to the ascendant? And then what does Pluto mean to Leo? And then finally, what does Pluto in the first house mean to Leo rising? All these layers we got to consider, right? The health of your sun, positive aspects to, more the dispositor of your Pluto. Whatever your rising sign is, if you're Sagittarius rising, you got Pluto in the first house. What does the health of your Jupiter look like? Because that's the first lord. This is going to help to define the parameters of the strength of using the positive or negative capacities of Pluto for your own good, or whether you're going to be eaten by the negative qualities. The status of your ascendant lord will show which path that you're likely to take, as well as the planets that are aspecting your first lord or your first house. Any positive or malefic planets that are in the first house will be amplified through the Pluto influence. The personality needs regeneration when Pluto is in the first house. If too withdrawn, the person has to learn to come out into the world and participate instead of retreating. If too aggressive and the urge for power is overemphasized, then the self must come to the realization it can be used by the power, but not be the power. It's Pluto in the first. And you'll learn the hard way if you decide that you want to be the power, how you can get burned, especially when you're using Pluto to do it. If positively directed, you'll still deal with that lesson, and it can be tough, and it can be positively, constructively used if you are the channel of some kind of deep force of power. You got to just make sure that everything is in balance with your ego and with your intention of what you're doing. In the house where Pluto is posited, there's great strength that can be used in a destructive or constructive way. The desire to use power must be overcome, to abuse power. Reactions to the upheavals Pluto brings will be very important. This is somebody who's probably felt some self-esteem issues for a long time, and now maybe they've grown up to be a cop or a police officer where they can finally express the opposite of the crippling self-esteem that they've felt. You can almost sympathize with them. These days, Pluto, the world right now is showing, it's 2020, there's riots going on, and there's lots of civil disobedience going toward police and authority figures. And anybody who's been in the police force who's had Pluto in the first house or around Aries or dealing with Mars or dealing with their first house lord, who might have taken advantage of others in the past, are now coming to confront this sublimation of their own ill feelings of themselves onto unwarranted people who have nothing to do with their self-inflicted pain. So any police officers who channeled their own pains onto others for no reason, undeservedly, are now confronting it, right? This is an example of Plutonian energy. The negative Plutonian tendencies of brooding, holding on to hurts, whether imaginary or real, the need to retaliate, vindictiveness, will react on the physical body as well as on the emotional vehicle. Moderation is a good key word for this position of Pluto. To retire into one's self, refusing to share ideas, motives, and dreams and ambitions, can be just as damaging to the personality as the giving of oneself totally to whatever ideal or cause one is moved by. It's either you're completely in or you're completely out. Either way, to be completely black and white one or the other is probably going to elicit the willfulness of Pluto, obviously, but it's going to have a lot of waves of consequences, for better or worse. The Minerva aspect of Pluto in the first house. Minerva is Isabel Hickey's way of describing the positive transmutation of the potential negative energy brought to a realization that can be used constructively in the spirit and the construction of the spirit and the soul. The Minerva aspect of Pluto in the first house is as constructive as the lower aspect is destructive. Especially because it's an angular house. It brings activity. It just naturally causes us to engage with whatever planets are occupying it. There is a perfect willingness to be a channel for healing and to be used by the forces of light. When positively expressed here with Pluto in the first, the personality is dissolved and the light streams through the vehicle, blessing all with whom it comes in contact. This aspect of the self comes through. The personality is dissolved in the solvent that we call understanding, especially by cramming your head instinctively, reactively into these hard dimensions of life, which Pluto in the first can do. Pisces rules the feet in the physical body. Feet have always been the spiritual symbol of understanding. When Jesus washed the feet of the disciples, it had a twofold meaning: the willingness to serve in perfect humility, and the cleansing of their understanding. Understanding, right, the feet. On the wall of the Hall of Learning, on the inner levels, the Piscean mantra was, "The disciple can stand in the presence of the master when his feet have been washed in the blood of the heart, of the instinct." On the Aquarian Hall of Learning, the mantra is, "The disciple can stand in the presence of the master when he can hear every bitter word as a cry for help, an answer from the heart of love, unstintingly." This is very much because of the instinct towards self is going to be obliterated, because the polar opposite of the first house is the seventh house. So the call to engage with others, to have a genuine compassionate sense that the other, your interaction with the other is just as important as your willfully driven interaction with yourself. Grounding something in yourself for the sake that you can act in relationship with others, right? Libra relates with sex, with our erotic chemistry with other people. The other, what am I in relation to others? And if Pluto is fixated on what I am, and that's all, the other is going to draw you towards a feeling of loneliness, these tempestuous feelings of self-isolatedness, which is just going to force you to ram your face into a wall, at which point hopefully someone in your life is just going to abduct you literally and rescue you, nurture you, so that you can see the value of breaking through and accepting love from other people. And even, if somebody in your life is constantly supporting you, first Pluto in the first house, you, and you always ignore them and think, obviously their love for you and their support of you is taken for granted. Eventually, if they go away in your life, it's a Plutonian drop in an essential supportive energy field, which will cause you to face up to the fact that you need others in your life to balance what you are in relationship. But you also can't let your need to be in relationship undermine what you are, your self-esteem. That's the tricky part about this particular combination, is that Pluto being where it is makes you have a hard self-esteem, and that's what causes you to act reactively, instinctively, and defensively with others is because you have no security with yourself. When it's in the 7th, it's a different thing, but it's very similar, ironically. I digress. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. That was Pluto in the first house. I'm going to be talking more about Pluto stuff at some point eventually. Like I said, I'm eventually going to do Jeffrey Wolf Green's readings. But if you enjoyed this, if you want to learn a little bit more about Pluto in general, check out the playlist that this video is a part of. It talks about all of the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, from a psychological counseling perspective, to give us all a sense of how these planets can be used in our own personal transformation. Hope you guys enjoyed this. I'm Dustin Cormier for How to Rock Astrology. See you guys on the next one. Oh, and feel free to watch to the end of this. We're going to talk about Pluto in aspect. It's the last part of this